Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Engineers Canada 30 by 30 virtual conference. I am Danny Chu, the current president of Engineers Canada. Over the next 3 weeks, you will meet speakers, panelists, and facilitators who are creating space for equity-deserving groups. And you will hopefully walk away feeling inspired and energized. 30 by 30 has always been about collaboration, researching, and sharing best practices across the country. In fact, 30 by 30 is framed as a collective impact project with multiple stakeholders working to increase the numbers of women in engineering. We recognize that women are facing multiple barriers to entering and succeeding in engineering all along their engineering journey. It is for this reason we chose the theme of this year's conference, Emerging Leadership. To achieve 30 by 30, we need to change the culture of exclusion within the engineering profession. To do this, we must shift the leadership and leadership culture. The Board of Engineers Canada has made it a strategic priority to address gender equity in engineering in our most recent strategic plan. And we continue to invest resources in our equity, diversity, and inclusion work. We are delighted to have added last year a new staff to our EDI team, and we have developed some exciting EDI resources for engineers and engineering employers, including an EDI course for engineers and geoscientists that will soon to be available across country. We have a great deal to do, but we are dedicated to support important conversation around cultural change, including those that through the hosting of this national conference. Today, we will hear from experts in workplace equity. On April 20, we will participate in an interactive workshop on intersectionality. Finally, on April 27, we will hear from 4 of our Engineers Canada's EDI leaders and participate in an experiential workshop on self-care for champions. I thank all of you for joining us today and showing that you are committed to learning from each other as we make engineering a welcoming profession for all. I want to end by saying that we are all coming together in a spirit of compassion and openness. We all have different journey and level of understanding. We must be empathetic that all attendees has different lived experiences, expertise, and knowledge. But we must also acknowledge the urgency of this work. Some are facing injustice every day, while others unlearn. I wish you all a meaningful and engaging conference.
Hello all, my name is Gerard McDonald. My pronouns are he, him, et il en français, and I'm the CEO of Engineers Canada. Welcome to the first session of the 2022 30 by 30 conference organized by Engineers Canada. Engineers Canada was founded to uphold the honor, integrity, and interests of the engineering profession. We work on behalf of the 12 provincial and territorial associations that regulate engineering practice and license the country's 300,000 members of the engineering profession. And our vision is to advance Canadian engineering through national collaboration. Before we get started today, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. Today's speakers and panelists will be speaking in English. However, there is simultaneous interpretation available in French. The instructions for how to access the interpretation are currently shown on the screen. Closed captioning in English is also available today and can be accessed using the closed captioning buttons in your Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. Should you encounter any technical problems during today's session, tech support is available in the chat. Please message Rochelle Shear in the participant list for support. We ask that you mute your microphone and turn off your camera to avoid any interruptions during the presentation. If at any time today you have questions for our speakers or panelists, we'd invite you to send them through the chat to Yasmin Tankan Blacklock, Associate Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Engineers Canada, Cassandra Polizou, Manager Equity and Diversity and Inclusion, and Yasmin will be monitoring the chat throughout the day. You can use the chat to connect with Encore, Yasmin, or Cassandra if you run into any issues. We'd also like to remind you of the resources provided to you for the conference, including the conference expectations. We remind everyone to approach this session with empathy, understanding, respect, and kindness for both your community and yourselves. I'll now pass it over to Cassandra, Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Engineers Canada, to carry on the opening ceremony.
Thank you so much, Gerard. And as part of our commitment to incorporating Indigenous ways of being and knowing into the engineering profession, and as this conference was initially meant to be placed in Alberta, we reached out to our partners at the University of Alberta, who kindly connected us to a local elder and knowledge keeper. A big shout out to Jessica Vandenberg and Nicole Wilson for their support in creating this relationship. It is with great pleasure and honor that I invite Elder Philip Tampu, a traditional woodland Cree, originally from Driftpile First Nation of Alberta, who has dedicated his life to sharing his knowledge and traditional values and lifestyle, to open our conference with a prayer. I also ask that you all participants today accept this prayer with openness in your hearts and minds. Elder Tampu, please bless this gathering space so that those gathered here today are able to learn from each other, are able to support each other, and do the work of challenging discrimination and inequity. I've placed and sent my intentions of this request in a tobacco according to traditional protocol, and it is in the mail to you right now. Elder Tampu, I'll pass it off to you. Thank you so much.
Before I start the opening prayer, I'd just like to mention it's an honor to be here today. I apologize for being in my truck, but I'm on the road and parked right now, and I look forward to this gathering, this conference, and always to acknowledge what I call Turtle Island, all across the country, the land we sit on today, to acknowledge it in a way that our ancestors once roamed this land and created what it is today. And I honor all the living beings here on Mother Earth. And in opening prayer, I ask you from your mind, your heart, to join me in prayer and to open your heart to not understand what it is today, why we gather here at the conference, that what we bring forward will help each of us, will bring the guidance, the understanding, and to have a dialogue where we can communicate in a way that is heartfelt, warming. And as I sit here before you on Mother Earth, I humbly ask you, now if you have a smudge, you can light it. When we light our smudge, what that does, it opens the door to what we call Creator, the spirit world. And we invite the holy ones to come and be with us, to come and hear our prayers, our thoughts, to hear and feel what we have to offer. And then we light the smudge to bring that balance in life. And as I sit here before you, I humbly ask you, join me in prayer. And I start in my language. And then I pray today for this gathering, this conference. I ask for special blessings, mainly for the organizers that made this happen, and that all the participants here today will be blessed with happiness, love, and kindness, and that they have a compassionate life that they could share with each and one another. So I ask you to join me at this time. Haunuta Wishimantua, Asamina Anatsagisigaw, Namasom Nokum, Piwichunan, Kakyo, Kanipon, Umutaski, Isakamau, Tansisa, Kapamatin, Gagiwai Mayatan, Gagispayan, Piwichunan Anatsagisigaw. Creator, today I call on you to call on the grandfathers, the grandmothers, to come and be with us here on Mother Earth. As we sit here in the circle of life, I humbly ask you, bring blessings to each one of us here. You see what is in our heart. You feel what we are going through. I ask you to lift the burdens that help us, that trouble us each day, to help us have a good mind, a good heart, and that we can share a dialogue today, that this conference which we're at today will help us, and that it'll help us in a way that we can help each other. I ask you today that what we share with each other today as we move forward in life, that what we share will help our children and our children's children, that one day they will sit here and carry on what we have brought forward. I ask you to help the organizers here today that make this happen, that you will bless them, bless their loved ones, their children, their family, and that they can continue on bringing forward the good work. This is what I ask of you today. As I sit here before you, I humbly ask you, Holy Ones, grandfathers, grandmothers, bless the land of Turtle Island as we sit on each one, that you will take care of Mother Earth so that it can sustain our life, that we can continue on in a healthy way. I ask you, Holy Ones, grandfathers, take my prayers to Creator and be with us at this time, that this day will go forward in a good way, that you will help us, bless our homes, keep our home fires safe. This is what I ask of you today. Take my prayers to Creator. Hi, hi. So thanks for the prayer, joining me in prayer. It's an honor to be here. And as we move forward in a good way, I humbly ask you to take forward your gift of life, your gift of knowledge, to help each other in a good way, to walk strongly and be open-minded today, and that you will help each other and communication. Thank you.
Elder. I'll pass it over to Joey.
Thank you, Elder Campo, for your kind words and prayers. We are so grateful to you for having found the time to be with us. Thank you again, and good morning and good afternoon to all the participants. I'm assuming, Cassandra, that I'm the one to speak right now? Yes?
Yes, my apologies, Jay.
Okay, no problem. And good morning and good afternoon. My name is Jay Nagendran. I'm a professional engineer, and I'm the registrar and CEO with APEGA, the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. We had really hoped that we could host you all here in person in Alberta, but unfortunately we were not. But we are glad we are still able to do this. This was originally conceived 2 years ago, and at least we are making it happen. So I want to say a special thanks to all the staff in Engineers Canada and APEGA for the work that they have done. Over the 3 sessions, over the next 3 weeks of the 30 by 30 conference, we are excited to feature speakers and panelists from Alberta's engineering profession who will talk about gender equity in the profession. I already saw 1 or 2 of the speakers, and they are outstanding. To sustain the profession, equity, diversity, and inclusion is very important. It allows for a diverse group of thinkers, attracting the best and the brightest, and thereby ultimately protecting the public better. A progressive regulator needs to embrace and foster activities that support EDI, and that's why APEGA is heavily into this initiative. APEGA has a strong connection with the 30 by 30 initiative. We conceived it in 2010, And we are very proud and happy that Engineers Canada embraced it in 2014 and made it a national program, and to raise the percentage of newly licensed females in engineering by 30% by 2030. We are committed to this initiative through our gender equity projects, having recently concluded a 3-year project on the barriers women face in engineering and geoscience. We are now embarking on additional government-funded projects that will provide insight into the barriers introduced or aggravated by COVID-19. From this, we will be able to develop resources for members and permit holders to challenge some of these barriers and make it better for all. Although 30 by 30 is a challenging and lofty goal, its success will benefit and strengthen our profession and better serve the public interest, something for all of us as engineers to hold paramount. It is now my pleasure to introduce Janet Southwood, Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnership with Engineers Canada, to tell you more about this feature. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much, Jay, and hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette Southwood. My pronouns are she, her, elle. I am Black, and I am an immigrant. I'm a professional engineer, and as Jay mentioned, I'm Vice President, Corporate Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Engineers Canada. Prior to joining Engineers Canada, I led the Canadian Urban Development and Infrastructure sector and the Global Sustainable Cities teams at an international consulting engineering firm, where I was the first Black woman to be appointed to the senior leadership position of principal globally. At Engineers Canada, my team's portfolios include public policy, public affairs and government relations, outreach and engagement, communications, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. The 30 by 30 initiative is a key file in our equity, diversity, and inclusion work and is framed by our strategic priority 2.1, Accelerate 30 by 30. Our team is hard at work developing national resources and a national research strategy, and leading and facilitating collaboration and knowledge sharing between regulators, higher education institutions, employers, and the broader engineering community. Today, you are all a key part of the 30 by 30 initiative, our national 30 by 30 conference, and we are happy to welcome you to this year's event. We're proud to share that we have met an unofficial goal that 30% by 2030 looks like it could be within reach. At the end of 2020, that is, by the end of December 31st, 2020, we reached 20% of newly licensed engineers who were female identifying. In other words, we met 20 by 20. We're very excited to continue this progress into the future and to work towards making the profession a better, more equitable reflection of broader society. I'll now turn the virtual floor over to Cassandra Polyzoo, our Manager, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Engineers Canada. Cassandra has been working on social justice and public engagement for over 20 years on a wide variety of campaigns and issues. She leads our equity, diversity, and inclusion work, including 30 by 30 and our Indigenous inclusion in engineering work. Over to you, Cassandra.
Thanks, Jeanette. Like Jeanette said, my name is Cassandra Polyzoo. My pronouns are she and her. I am a cisgendered, able-bodied woman, a child of Greek and East Indian immigrants here to Canada. And I work and play on the Indigenous lands. And I recognize that I am a visitor on the traditional and unceded lands of the Omawin, Ninewag, and Anishinaabe peoples. I also want to acknowledge that today is International Day of Pink, which is an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to fight against all forms of bullying, discrimination, homophobia, and transphobia. As I was reflecting on some of the overall observations of the last 4 years working with 30 by 30, I think we've learned a lot of different things, and we've learned that we need to look outside the engineering profession to other professions, to social sciences, to gender studies, to better understand how engineering culture might potentially change. And that is the change that needs to be also systemic and institutionalized across individuals, across organizations, and all levels to really be successful. We need to also frame our work around gender equity towards valuing differences between peoples of all genders. our success in this initiative needs to be grounded in a feminist approach, in an intersectional approach at the same time. We need to recognize the diversity of experiences of womanhood and how that plays out differently for Black and Indigenous women, women of color, foreign trained women, women with visible and invisible disabilities, all working in the engineering workplace. That is why we are so keen to hear from today's keynote, from today's speakers, who are all shining light on different aspects of gender equity in the workplace. Next, to introduce our keynote for today, I would like to invite my colleague, Joey Taylor, Engineers Canada's Manager for Public Affairs, Government Relations, to take the stage.
Thanks, Cassandra. So hi, everyone. My name is Joey Taylor. My pronouns are he, him, it, and I'm the Manager of Public Affairs at Engineers Canada. In this capacity, I'm responsible for all public policy and advocacy efforts to ensure that the federal government addresses the public interests and concerns of the engineering profession, also while enabling policymakers to address the expertise and the experiences of professional engineers. Engineers Canada has long advocated for addressing challenges that discourage women from entering and remaining in the engineering profession. This includes addressing pay inequity and inflexible maternity leave policies. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker for the 2022 30 by 30 conference, Federal Pay Equity Commissioner Karen Jensen. Karen Jensen is an experienced lawyer who is widely recognized as an expert in human rights, labor, and employment law. Ms. Jensen is known for her collaborative and respectful approach to her work and has held many positions, including partner at Norton Rose Fulbright LLP and assistant dean at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Before her legal career, Ms. Jensen worked with marginalized women and sexual abuse survivors in social services agencies, both in Winnipeg and Toronto. Having represented union employers in the Canadian Human Rights Commission and pay equity dispute at different points of her career, Ms. Jensen has developed a deep appreciation for all perspectives on this important issue. If you have any questions for the commissioner, we ask that you enter them in the chat and they will be answered following the presentation. Please welcome Karen Jensen.
Thanks so much, Joey. First of all, I'd like to thank Engineers Canada for inviting me to participate in this conference. But I would also like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the land that I'm speaking to you from today as part of the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So I'm really honored to be asked to give the keynote address at an important conference like this. 30 years ago, I was, like many of you, breaking into a profession that was largely male dominated. And it was hard, but it has also been an incredibly rewarding and fulfilling career. And I know that yours will be too. Many of the barriers that early women engineers faced are coming down. And with goals like 30 by 30, the critical mass needed to remove even more barriers will happen. So I'm not here today to tell you war stories about how hard it was for women in male-dominated professions like law and engineering to make it, though I do have many. I'm here rather to let you know that I see change happening and I see that change accelerating. So I want you to feel inspired and hopeful. But first, the bad news. There is still a gender wage gap in spite of the years and years of work we've done to try to eliminate that gap. Even though there are more women than men attending post-secondary institutions, they continue to earn less than men in the labor market. So in Canada, in 2020, the general wage gap was 11%. Sadly, though, the gender wage gap in STEM is larger. In 2020, the gender wage gap for STEM jobs was estimated to be between 17 and 21%. The 17% represented the gap at the beginning of the career, and unfortunately, the gap increases to 21% within 5 years of starting the career. So even though the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics sector, STEM, is generally better paid, women are still less likely than men to choose this field as a career. When they do choose it, women are paid less than men. So why is this? Well, there are many factors that can explain the wage gap, such as the fact that a higher proportion of women work part-time and therefore annually earn less than men. This part-time work is because still to this day, the bulk of care work at home falls largely on women's shoulders. And when women take maternity leaves, they pay what's called a motherhood penalty. That is, their compensation stalls out while that of their male colleagues goes up. Women are also less likely to receive the promotions to which they're entitled, perhaps out of concern that they won't be able to deal with the heavy workload when they have young children. And then there's the undervaluation of women's work. Studies have shown that when a woman does the job, it is seen as less skilled and less valuable than when a man undertakes the same job. Why is that? Well, unconscious biases creep into the evaluation of work that is done by women and expected of women. So even in tech roles, women are seen as responsible often for the emotional climate of the office. They're seen as the glue that holds the office together. And that's the unpaid emotional care work that women do in the home and that we are also expected to do in the office. This reinforces the perception that women do the less skilled caring work in the office, while men generate revenue or do the technical work. That in turn contributes to the undervaluation of women's work. A study done at Stanford Graduate School of Business showed that while women are viewed generally as more helpful and considerate in the workplace than men, this characteristic is not valued by employers as much as traits typically associated with men, such as having a take charge attitude or being a visionary. One of the results of that undervaluation of the work done by women in STEM is that women continue to be disproportionately placed in non-professional STEM roles, though they are no less qualified than their male colleagues. Women with a bachelor's degree in a STEM field are more likely than men to be in technical rather than professional roles. So 30% of technical roles are filled by women with bachelor's degrees, while 21% of technical roles are filled by men with similar degrees, according to 2017 data. So there's no denying that the challenges for women in STEM fields remain significant. In a male-dominated work environment, there are attitudinal barriers that don't always happen on purpose. Unconscious biases mean that we may not even be aware of prejudices that shape our decisions and characterize our environment. So, for example, the perception that a woman who has kids may be less likely to want to go for a beer after work than her male colleagues with kids is not based on so-called toxic masculinity. It's based on a taken for granted assumption that women spend more time caring for children than men. That kind of unconscious or unexamined assumption does affect our chances of success in the professional world, because women may be seen as less committed to the workplace than our male colleagues based on those unexamined assumptions. And I can tell you that I have felt the influence of those assumptions on my career, and you may also feel them. However, we should not be discouraged by this. You are all here today because you strongly believe that a paradigm shift is possible, because you believe in yourselves, and because you believe that initiatives like 30 by 30 can change the face of STEM. And you're right. Critical mass is needed to bring about lasting change. We need more women in the STEM world who will shake up the way business is done and challenge the assumptions that keep us from moving ahead, all of us. The Government of Canada also supports this paradigm shift. This can be seen in the introduction of a legislative regime in the federal sector that encourages and supports federally regulated employers in their efforts to advance gender equality in their workplaces. Examples include the Employment Equity Act, the recent inclusion of pay transparency measures in the employment equity regulations, and the Pay Equity Act. The Employment Equity Act is different from the Pay Equity Act. The Employment Equity Act has been around for a while, and it requires federally regulated employers with 100 or more employees to take actions to ensure the full representation of members of 4 designated groups in the workplace: women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of racialized groups. This legislation helps to increase diversity in federally regulated workplaces, especially in male-dominated ones, such as the STEM sector. Pay transparency also helps reduce the gender wage gaps. Amendments to the Employment Equity Act and regulations require federal private sector employers with more than 100 employees to collect new salary data that reveal whether there are pay gaps in that workplace. In June of this year, this new salary data will be included for the first time in employers' annual reporting on employment equity. This will help employers and employees to determine whether there are wage gaps based on gender, race, and disability. Those gaps may be found in overtime pay, overtime hours worked, bonus pay, and other kinds of pay in the workplace. And they'll be published online so that employees can see if there are gaps. Now, the new Pay Equity Act, for which I am responsible, is another tool to address the undervaluation of women's work that contributes to the gender wage gap. The Act came into effect on August 31st, 2021. It requires federally regulated employers, that's banks, telecommunications companies, interprovincial transportation companies, rail, airway, postal services, those employers with an average, and including the federal government, with an average of 10 or more employees to take a proactive approach to closing the wage gap in their workplaces. So equal pay laws, such as the Federal Pay Equity Act, require employers to review their compensation structures and practices, even if they don't think they have a wage gap, even if they don't think they have a problem in their workplace with respect to compensation practices, they still have to undertake this review. And this allows them to determine with empirical evidence as to whether individuals are being compensated fairly based on the value that they bring to the organization and not their gender. So the new pay equity legislation will go a long way to closing the wage gap in federally regulated STEM industries. And in fact, pay equity is a tool for helping companies attract the best talent, which allows them to outperform their peers. It communicates the message to employees, and employees are increasingly looking for this kind of message, that their wages will no longer be based on irrelevant considerations like gender, but rather the value they bring to the organization. And this changes the culture of an organization. Just the very action on the part of the employer of undertaking this exercise of evaluating compensation practices, it changes the culture of the organization. And in fact, in the federal regime, the Federal Pay Equity Act requires many organizations to conduct the pay equity exercise in a committee comprised of worker representatives who have a voice and a say in how the exercise is done. The pay equity exercise can then contribute to workplace democracy, transparency, and fairness. And this is all good for people starting out in their professions, like many of you, or those of you who are in mid-career, or even the tail end of your career. This is all very encouraging and motivating for workers. These kinds of legislative initiatives mean that the barriers that many of you will face will not be as daunting or as exhausting as previous generations of women have faced. They constitute an acknowledgement that in the past, the workplace has not been a fair and equitable place for many people, including women. And it's an acknowledgement that this has to change. Legislation like the Federal Pay Equity Act has teeth to ensure that those who are still unwilling to make those changes will face stiff monetary penalties for refusing to do so. So there's no more pleading for change. We mean business now. And I'm happy to say that most employers recognize that it is indeed good business to address equity in the workplace, including pay equity. Many actually do see pay equity as a tool for improving their businesses. It is our belief that now is the time to advance gender equality and reduce the wage gap. However, legislation alone is not enough. We all need to be the change we want to see. Men in the workplace can be important allies in the change process. As more men begin to take full paternity leave, to which they're entitled under the EI Act, and continue to make it clear that they need to, for example, pick up the kids from daycare, attitudes towards women will shift in the workplace. No longer will it be seen as a fait accompli that women are the primary caregivers and men are the primary breadwinners. Instead, employers will see that care work is evenly distributed. And so they will not hesitate to hire women or to promote them because they will not assume that women are going to be doing all the caregiving at home. Men in the workplace can demonstrate loudly and vocally that they are caregivers too, and that their female colleagues are excellent candidates for promotion. This conference is an opportunity to encourage each other to be courageous, to challenge our taken for granted assumptions, and to learn about initiatives that are helping to close the gender wage gap and empower women to succeed. The challenges that the world will face in the coming years require creative, innovative, and skilled people like you. But that means we need workplaces that truly support women and other groups that have traditionally been marginalized in the workplace. We need workplaces where it's okay to challenge assumptions about what's normal, what is fair, and what is acceptable. And we need laws that support those changes and put the responsibility on employers to address the barriers to full equality in the workplace. I'm excited about the changes I see happening, and I'm so excited to see how these changes will empower you, our new generation of women and men in engineering, to do the important work you will do in our world. Thank you so much for the honor of speaking with you today, and have a great conference.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for your excellent work in the field and for your inspiring words. We will now take questions from the audience. Please remember to send any of your questions to Yasmin Tanakan Blackhawk through the chat, as we mentioned before. I guess to get us started, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the difference between the complaints-based approach and a proactive approach to pay equity.
Sure, Joy. I actually have quite a bit of experience in both, really, now. The complaints-based approach is the approach that has been used always in the past when women feel that they are underpaid relative to men in the workplace, or female-dominated professions are underpaid relative to male-dominated professions. And that is under human rights legislation like the Canadian Human Rights Act, people had to come forward and bring complaints if they thought that this was happening. That puts quite a heavy burden on employees, and employees are often in a vulnerable place in the workplace where they fear that if they agitate for change, they will be retaliated against, even though there's anti-retaliation provisions in all human rights legislation. It's still a scary thing. It still requires enormous resources to bring a complaint. So, after many, many years of using this kind of a system, it was recognized that it wasn't working. And I saw firsthand in the litigation that I did in the area of pay equity, the incredible burden, and told that this kind of litigation took not only on unions and employees, but also on employers. And it really wasn't working for anyone. There was a lot of money being paid out to lawyers, and that money would have been better paid out to the employees who were underpaid. So that's why legislation like the new Pay Equity Act was introduced, and it exists also in Quebec and in Ontario, and to some extent in other provinces in Canada, although in other provinces it's mainly for the public sector. But in Ontario, Quebec, and the federal sector, it applies to both private and public sector, and it puts the burden on the employers, as I said in my comments, to proactively do the analysis and ensure, whether they think they have a problem or not, that they are in fact paying women and men equitably in the workplace. And that's a really important step to making the regime much more effective and less burdensome and costly for the workers themselves.
Great, yeah. You touched a bit upon this during your speech when it came to the legislation, but can you elaborate maybe how the Canadian Human Rights Commission will address pay equity for most vulnerable women, such as Indigenous women or women of color, with women with disabilities?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Joey, because we know that it's the situation for marginalized women, for women who are experiencing intersectional identities is much different. So whereas the wage gap that I originally was speaking about, 89 women earn 89 cents on the male dollar, is what it is, sort of globally speaking. It is the wage gap is much greater for other groups. So for example, Indigenous women working full-time, full year, earn an average of 35% less than non-Indigenous men. And so that means they earn 65 cents to the dollar for non-Indigenous men. Racialized women are earning 67 cents to the male non-racialized dollar. Newcomer women are earning 71 cents to the male dollar, and sadly, women with a disability are earning 54 cents to the dollar. So that indicates to us that we really need to take an intersectional approach to looking at this problem. And because oftentimes women in marginalized groups and women with disabilities and so on make up a large percentage of certain sectors in society, we believe that pay equity legislation that looks at sectors and groups of women within the workplace who are in predominantly female roles will benefit those marginalized women. It will raise the wage, so to speak, for all women, and that will particularly impact on and help women who are marginalized.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question regarding the federal acts that you discussed. And do these acts only apply to federal departments and federally regulated entities, or do they extend to all public sector organizations and even out to some private sector organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not always super clear. But in the federal sector, so that's banking, telecommunications, postal sector, and the federal government, the legislation applies across Canada, both in the private and the public sector. However, if a particular organization is not in the federal sector, but rather in the provincial sector, so that would be schools and health clinics, many engineering consulting firms, for example, are provincially regulated, then you have to look to the particular province that you find yourself in to determine if there's a Pay Equity Act in place. And as I indicated, in both Quebec and Ontario, there is proactive pay equity legislation that applies in both the public and private sectors, so both government and private sector. But in other parts of Canada, unfortunately, at this point, it's either no pay equity legislation, so the human rights codes apply, or the Pay Equity Act that's in place in other provinces applies only to the public sector, meaning government. So we have a tool on our website that allows people to determine whether the federal act applies to them, and if not, what provincial act or what provincial body they should consult with. So I would really encourage people to go to our website and use that tool. It's called the Compass, and it's pretty helpful.
Thank you for that. We have a bit of a practical question, the next one. So what advice would you give to HR teams who have completed the pay gap, shared some of the results internally, so either the percentage closure, but are resistant to share beyond that or go further? For example, an ideal next step is to complete pay transparency and job ads, for example, but culturally organizations may not be there yet. They have closed a pay gap. So how can we move or shift towards more pay transparency in a workplace?
Yeah, that is a really great question, because it really gets at something that I think your conference is trying to address, which is cultural change. And that can be a very challenging exercise. And I empathize with everyone who's involved in that process. Having worked on these issues myself for decades now, I can tell you that probably the most successful thing you can do around issues like pay transparency and challenging leadership to loosen the grip that they have on information is really to approach it in as open-hearted and straightforward a manner as possible, and to speak openly and honestly with leadership and with colleagues about why transparency is important. Having worked in the private sector myself, I know that very often employers view information about pay, compensation, as a competitive tool that's used to attract talent. And so they're reluctant to publish any information about it, because that will be giving away a competitive advantage. And so there's a lot of resistance to doing that. And I understand that, because, as I say, I've spent time in the private sector, so I really understand that. And so it took me a while to understand that even though, we may see that as a competitive advantage, the downside is significant enough to warrant looking at whether there are other sort of competitive strategies that we can use to attracting top talent. For example, being a leader in the industry around transparency, around pay equity, and attracting talent in that way, by showing, we understand the detriment that this puts workers at when they're trying to negotiate salaries, when they haven't got a clue. I myself under negotiated my own starting salary in one place that I worked, because I had no idea what the going rate was, and I under negotiated by a significant amount relative to my male colleagues. And so employers are increasingly recognizing that this is important if they want to attract top talent. So dialogue, discussion, speaking from personal experiences with people in the workplace is the right way to go.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. I guess our last question would be, Are there any incentives from government to the private sector that would encourage employers to be more open to wage equity and wage transparency? Any work that you're kind of doing in that realm?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I would say financial incentives, probably not, although the Pay Equity Act, the Federal Pay Equity Act, does recognize that some employers might find themselves in situations of extreme financial hardship. And in such cases, not only is there provision for phasing in pay equity related increases, but you can even extend the 3 to 5 year phase-in period beyond that when you find yourself in extreme financial hardship. So there are allowances within our act to recognize. That's not an incentive per se, but it is a recognition that in many cases, the financial situation may be particularly challenging given what we've just gone through in terms of the pandemic and the knock-on effects in the economy. But the biggest incentive that I would say exists with pay equity and other kinds of equity legislation is that it is increasingly seen as the way that business has to be operating, and it is increasingly seen as a tool for attracting top talent and for retaining that talent, because the workers of this generation are telling us plainly, I'm not staying in a workplace where I feel like my contributions are not being valued appropriately, where the employer is not becoming up to date with the understanding of equity and the importance of equity. So if you want to attract and retain top talent and thereby increase your revenues, you need to get on with these kinds of activities. It's really not an option to ignore them any longer.
Great point. So thank you so much for that. So thank you again, Federal Pay Equity Commissioner Karen Jensen. We were so grateful that you were able to join us today in this really great Q&A session. Next, thank you so much. Next, we're pleased to have some representatives from APEGA join us today to discuss some of the incredible research that they've done. Please help me in welcoming Heather Kennedy, who is the chair of the Women in APEGA Advisory Group.
Thanks, Joey. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's always hard to know. Bonjour, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the country. By way of background, Women in APEGA Advisory Group, or WINAPEGA as we more affectionately call it, is comprised of men and women who are passionate about advancing gender equity in engineering and geoscience in Alberta. And since 2011, we've provided recommendations to APEGA's Registrar and CEO, Jay Nagandran, who you actually saw this morning earlier, or this afternoon earlier, that are geared towards increasing representation, engagement, and retention of women in engineering and geoscience. And as just one example, we were pleased to provide input to the work of a federal government grant that investigated the barriers that women face in the engineering and geoscience workplace. And we've been most happy to use this data that was provided to us by our most generous members to better measure the issues and to assist in finding solutions. You know, I certainly don't have to tell this audience the importance of this work and its results. Creating this diversity will actually make Alberta a stronger place. However, I also likely don't have to tell you that this kind of societal change is hard, and that the full spectrum of views is alive and well. You might wonder why a man is leading and presenting this work later in a few minutes, or even why men are part of this conversation. And this work requires everyone's active involvement, looking past gender or other labels to see the value of the individual and what they bring to our success. I'm excited to have male allies and that take an active part in this space, working with us, being led by us, leading us, challenging us, making it better. It's my pleasure to introduce Mohamed El Daly, who has been working with us at Women in APEGA for 7.5 years now, and he's led numerous gender equity projects. Mohamed is a professional engineer with a master's in civil engineering, and he is the Director, Outreach and Product Services, overseeing APEGA's outreach and equity and diversity and inclusion portfolios. He has over 20 years of project management and leadership experience, and he is an ally. In addition to graduating from Cornell University's Diversity and Inclusion program, he holds a Canadian Certified Inclusion Professional designation from the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion, and in 2020 was actually recognized by them as the Diversity and Inclusion Practitioner of the Year. He's also the recipient of the Human Rights Award from the John Humphrey Center for Peace and Human Rights for his efforts to promote STEM education for underrepresented groups and Indigenous communities. Please join me in welcoming Mohamed. Over to you. I think you're on mute, Mohamed.
And I did it. So thank you, Heather, for the introduction, and thank you, Engineers Canada, for the invitation. Can just someone confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank
You're
you
good.
so much. So good evening and good afternoon and good morning, everyone, based on where you are across the nation. My name is Mohamed, and I'm glad to be here today with you to talk about pay equity in the engineering and geoscience workplaces in Alberta. Again, I want to thank Engineers Canada for inviting me to share the findings of our research, and for Heather Kennedy, the chair of our Women in APEGA Advisory Group, for the introduction. Today we'll give a quick introduction on why is pay equity important and why APEGA embarked on conducting research around pay equity, the methodology that we used to do data analysis, the sampling sizes, and the variables that we considered, some key findings from our research, and then conclude by calls to action for individuals, leaders, and organizations to take this research and put it into practice in our daily work. And then we'll have some time for Q&A in the end. So why pay equity? Why is it important, and why did we consider doing this research? In 2018, APEGA was granted a federal grant to look and address systemic barriers that are facing women in the workforce, specifically engineering and geoscience in Alberta. And as we started to conduct a survey for our membership and have consultations and focus groups, the pay equity piece repeatedly came to the forefront. It was mentioned by our members that it's a challenge, it's a problem. We heard earlier from Commissioner Karen about the gap between men and women, and we wanted to have an evidence-based analysis on what is the status in Alberta. Gender pay equity is also widely recognized in Canada and globally as an indicator of women's economic inequality. And there was a UN human rights report published in 2015 that noted that pay equity, or the pay gap in Canada, is one of the biggest worldwide, but in Alberta, it's the worst across the nation. So Alberta is behind all other provinces when it comes, and territories when it comes to the pay gap. So in order to understand the nature of the pay differences in the engineering and geoscience spaces, we engaged with a consultant to review the gender pay gap across our industries using APEGA salary survey data from 2014 to 2018. So 5-year worth of data that we had previously collected and put it under the scrutiny of our consultant to look at it from an EDI lens and from an pay equity standpoint. APEGA salary survey is conducted every year where companies, permit holding companies, would submit their compensation data, base salary, benefits, long-term incentives, and then it's analyzed and reported on an aggregate scale. So each spring, this activity is conducted. It's currently open for 2022. And with all this data in place, we had a great head start to be able to look into it and try to figure out what would come out of it. Before going into our methodology, I want to acknowledge and thank all our staff who worked on this project for the past 4 years, and the Women in APEGA Advisory Group specifically, who continue to provide continuous support, guidance, and advice as we went through this journey. So how did we do it? As I mentioned, we started by the APEGA salary survey, the annual compensation data. Between 2014 and 2018, we had almost 40,000 records. So this is 40,000 data points for members working in the engineering and geoscience workplaces. And our focus was primarily on base salary information only. So we excluded anything beyond the base salary, incentives, long-term benefits, allowances, just to ensure consistency, because not all positions and types of employment will include these. When we looked at the data variables, what we considered at the individual level is the disciplines they're working in, their specialty, position levels, and we broke them into 3 categories. So entry level, and these would include co-op students, fresh grad, and few years of experience, 2 to 3. And then qualified, where it's above 5 years of experience to 10 years of experience, managers and directors level, and then senior, and these were senior directors, vice presidents, C-suite, and CEOs. Years of experience, age, education, and APEGA licensure. And on the organization level, we looked at the industry classification and the organization size by revenue and by the number of employees. And in order to determine whether there is a significant pay gap or not, we conducted data analysis. And for those who are in love with statistics like myself, we conducted an independent sample t-tests and calculated p-values, or in essence, to figure out whether it's statistically significant or not. So our APEGA salary survey data from 2014 to 2018, as you can see, has seen significant growth. Participation levels changed from 2014 to 2018. There was 190% increase in participation and 45% increase in data points collected. And while this is great to see the level of participation and interest, it creates some noise when we look at the data and how we are analyzing it. And this noise can cause a challenge and make it difficult to isolate underlying trends in the data and what the pay gap really is when we try to break it down by incumbent or organization. And accordingly, what we elected to do is to select a key 30 organizations that participated consistently from 2014 to 2018. And this was what we called the year-over-year sample. So these 30 organizations form the year-over-year sample that you see on the right side of the table. The main sample is here. So this is all the data that's being collected. And then the year-over-year sample is the focused group, 30 organizations participating consistently and thus allowing us to conduct a longitudinal analysis and also serve to identify the underlying data trends without the noise of changes in participation. You would see that the numbers still change between one year to the other in the year-over-year sample, and these variations are caused by just annual voluntary or involuntary turnover in staff within these 30 organizations. However, it was pretty much consistent in terms of break of gender between both samples. So high level of the methodology. Now, what did we find out? And I share some 6 key findings. However, our report published on the website has more additional information, and happy to discuss further with anyone who's interested offline if you have interest in specific findings or more information about the data. The first was that the proportion of female in engineering and geoscience workplaces did not change over the past 5 years. And when I'm talking about the proportion of females, it's approximately 20%. So within the workforce, there's 20% female professionals consistently over the course of 5 years. This is quite interesting when you think about it, because I'm sure we all know, and we saw the data earlier from Engineers Canada, the percentage of newly licensed female professionals, while increasing, it's still hovering around 20%. So there's 80% male being newly licensed and joining the workforce. So the fact that there is still more male joining the workforce and the percentage of women in the workforce is not decreasing implies, and when you look at the data, says that less women are leaving the profession than men. There is more men leaving the profession. And this is generational. If you break down the data by generations, you'll notice that the silent generation and the baby boomers where not only predominantly men, they're almost all of them were men except very few female professionals. And as they retire, we can see that more of them are leaving while women are still remaining in the profession. So this is a great indication. It talks about the recruitment efforts that are happening at the outreach levels, and that the recruitment, while going well, and we hope to see it improve, it's paying off right now. The second key finding is about the proportion of females in senior levels, and it also hadn't changed in 5 years. So if we look at the entry level, there's around 25 to 29% female professionals. When you go to the qualified, and these are a little bit higher, so the percentage drops to 20 to 23%, senior 10 to 12%, and then at the executive level, it's 4 to 9%. It's really, really small. And this identifies a key challenge in terms of promotion. The previous slide, we're talking about recruitment. There is a challenge in promotion of women in the profession. Our research showed that men are promoted at twice the rate of women, and accordingly, we see this attrition, which is quite challenging. So it's important to understand and recognize that we really need to focus on promotion and understand our policies and procedure are promoting men and women in the profession, and specifically what impacts the drop in women promotion levels. Third finding is overall average base salary has dropped from 2014 to 2018. In 2018, it was 7.5% below the levels, the highest levels in 2015, and it has not recovered the dollar value since then. And this decline has been evident across all position levels, all genders, and industry segments as well. You can see the male average is higher than the female, and you need to be aware that this is just the average. If we plot it in form of a distribution or a histogram, you'll see that there are some common areas between them, but the average is skewed for the men because there's higher pay, and this shows the pay gap. So when we dig into the different levels, we notice that the entry level pay is not significant when differentiated by gender. So men and women are paid almost identical or exactly the same at entry levels. And this consistency in pay is likely reflective of the standard rates for new graduates. There isn't experience, there isn't much to evaluate them on. It's primarily education, which is a good indicator because the focus here is on competency, and competency is translated in the form of education. And accordingly, there isn't much pay gap between genders. However, when we start moving forward in experience, and when we start hitting the 5-year mark, 5-year worth of experience, the average female base salary starts dropping gradually. So at 5-year mark, it goes from 95 to 93%. And when you continue at 10, it's 93 to, over that, sorry, at 25 to 25 years worth of experience, it's 93% all the way down to 87%. So from 100%, they're both paid the same when graduating, all the way at 25 years, where women are paid at 87% of male pay. Just to put it in perspective, this means that women would be working for free starting November 17th. So after that, they work for free. Or to put it in a different way, women need to work after the year is over until February 13th to make up what their male colleagues have made the year before. So you need to work 42 or 43, excuse me, 42 or 43 additional days, almost 6 additional weeks to compensate for this pay gap. So this is how significant the pay gap is. And as Commissioner Khan had mentioned earlier, it's the motherhood penalty that kicks in at the 5-year mark. So the reason we see this drop is this is the mark where women would leave to start a family, and because they bear they are the primary care for providing for the children, accordingly they leave. When they return, companies are evaluating pay in relevant to years of service or experience, and it's penalizing women. And the last key finding is that these statistically significant differences in pay were noticed in the different industries and in the different disciplines. You can see the same pattern consistent across all of them. Few other noteworthy items is that all.
You just muted, Mohamed.
Sorry, yep. All the pay gap differences can be explained by contextual factors. So these contextual factors can be the level, the grade, the location of the job or the type of job, the responsibilities, or combination of these factors. So there is explanation to it. However, what these explanations or reasons miss is the equity piece between men and women. Individual factors that influence pay included experience, performance, and people management. General experience for the individual were found to be the most consistent factor impacting pay, but it wasn't consistent between a company to company due to pay compression. And pay compression is in essence the idea that an individual having been in the job for numerous number of years will be paid less than someone who is newly hired due to how the markets are working. And then job-specific experiences had an influence, but on the overall compensation and not the base salary. So when we compare this to Canada overall, as we mentioned earlier in the keynote speech, women across Canada are paid at 89 cents to the dollar of their men's average hourly wage. And as Commissioner Karen mentioned, Indigenous women, for example, working full-time are earning 65 cents to the dollar. This means, if just we put it to perspective, they should have been working until yesterday. They should have been working 101 additional days after the year is over to make what their male colleagues have made the year before. So knowing all of that, what can we do? And at APEGA, we'd like always to break down the actions into the individual level, the leader, and the organization. We believe everyone has a role to play. So if you're an individual, you do not have an influence over other people, you can start by yourself. You can start by informing yourself about market data, APEGA salary survey, or other salary surveys being conducted across the different provinces and territories to inform yourself and know what the different jobs and positions pay. Negotiate salary and know your worth, and understand that you can apply for jobs even if you do not check all the boxes. Give it a try and get out there. Also, attend training in the EDI space and learn and understand how unconscious bias, conscious inclusion, the different aspects can come at play so that you are more informed when you join the workforce to have these conversations. If you are a leader, if you wear the hat of a leader and you oversee a group of people, educate yourself, attend trainings, and extend these trainings to your staff. But more importantly, support your staff who are going on a parental leave, and be aware that you are not putting practices in place that are penalizing them. You're not putting them off important projects. You're not delaying the return, and after they return, they wait for another 6 to 8 months until they join another meaningful project. It is important, it is key. At the organization level, it's important to understand that pay needs to be tied to competency rather than experience. Every time we put X number of years of experience required, we're in essence taking a shortcut, and we cannot really articulate what are the competencies, the skills required. And we take the easy route out by saying X number of years of experience, assuming that someone working in the job for a number of years have acquired the skills. Years of service does not equate to acquiring skills and being good at it. So focus on competency-based rather than just years of experience. And consistently review your job architecture and pay scale, and understand what biases are kicking in and how to level the playing field for all individuals working in your organization. This is a high-level summary of a piece of our research on pay equity. The full report, as I mentioned, is available on our website. Feel free to download it. And if you have any questions, happy to take some now. And if you have further, you can reach us at edi@apega.ca, and either myself or one of our EDI team will get back to you, or my personal email. Thank you, and I hand it back over to Cassandra.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. I think we might have some time for questions. I'm just going to check in with Yasmin to see if they have, she's got any questions in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. Mohammed, would you like me to read them for you, or would you like to read them from the chat yourself?
Sure, I have one question here, correct?
Exactly.
Yes. So the one question that I have we considered underemployment in our data analysis? If not, would you anticipate a change in data if it was considered? So the data set that we looked at did not include underemployment. The salary survey would collect data for only employment. The underemployment, or sometimes it would be considered contractors, was not considered as part of this research. Would we anticipate a change in data if it was considered? Definitely, it will definitely create a change, but I do not know what kind of change. What I can share is that APEGA recently got another provincial grant that will allow us to evaluate and conduct another pay equity analysis until the year 2023. So the underemployment piece would be taken into consideration, considering the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on our membership. The next question, do you have data about year of leave for men and women? It looks to me that the pay gap is not just explained by actual years of working, but instead that there is an ongoing penalty for taking leave. So this is a correct statement. There is an ongoing penalty because in essence, when women go on leave, every time their pay is evaluated in most companies, it's by years of service. Or if they call it years of experience, it counts for the years that they worked and excludes parental leave. However, our data showed that when it hits the 15 to 20 year mark, sometimes this gap is less. And when we looked into data, we'll find that most positions that are looking for senior directors, vice presidents, they start removing the language around X number of years of experience. It starts focusing on competencies and skills. So this is why we recommend that companies are looking and focusing on competency-based pay rather than years of experience. How would you encourage other provincial engineering associations to do the pay equity work that we are doing? The first thing is you need to have data. We were fortunate that we were conducting the salary survey for a number of years, so we had a wealth of data. So if you're conducting a salary survey, that's a good start. If not, I'd encourage you consider starting that, or look at other groups within the province doing this kind of work. And I'm happy to talk to anyone offline to kind of give input on how we embarked on this and talk more about our methodology. Do you recommend writing skills acquired from caregiving work, parental, elder care, and community care into job description? I'm not sure I understand this question. Do we recommend writing skills acquired from caregiving work into job descriptions? If you mean in terms of companies or organizations crafting their job description, there is a full science and art around how to write the job description. And more importantly, it's not about the skills acquired during caregiving. It's about asking yourself, what are the key skills required to be successful at this role, and how to articulate them. And after you write it, you ask yourself, if someone does not have this skill, will they be successful or not? Is there another skill or competency that can compensate? The kind of laundry list of all skills that we write just to make sure that we encompass everything is deterring a lot of competent candidates from applying, and it's impacting underrepresented groups more than others. What is happening now with this data and resulting actions by employers who participated? So the data has been shared by employers who participated. We continue to present the data and encourage them to reflect and revisit their job descriptions and pay scales. But we understand as well our role as a regulator. We do not have authority over this space, but we can influence and encourage and act as a catalyst. So conducting this kind of research and having it publicly available, I hope that it will encourage people to take it and leverage it and use it. Really appreciate the salary survey APEGA posted. It helps with being aware of salary expectations for a role. So glad to hear that. are the employers that participate in the study reflective of Canada? So the employers that participated in the study are definitely reflective of Alberta in the engineering and geoscience workspaces. It's a statistically significant data set. If you want the exact numbers, it's at 95% statistically significant with 2% margin of error. Is it reflective of Canada? No, I did not do this analysis to see if it's reflective of Canada or not, so I cannot comment on that. But the data that I shared in the presentation and that we found sees similar numbers. So across Canada, women are paid at 89% to their male colleagues across all industries. Is our data representative of other engineering and geoscience workplaces across Canada or not? I don't know. Women tend to avoid hard tasks like field assignments. Field hands-on experience is most valuable competencies. Women should be more open to take on those tasks. I have a different opinion, and whoever posted this, thanks for allowing me the opportunity to speak to it, if I may. When we say women tend to avoid hard tasks like field assignments, we need to first ask, is the field assignment set up for success for women? When we're sending women on fields and they come back and say, I do not want to go back on the field, is it because they are not interested in the hard assignment, or is it because the field, the setup is not up for success? Our research has shown that a lot of women are competent, can do the work, but when they go, there is no setup for success. The place is not inclusive. They do not have at least as the bare minimum needs for them, separate washrooms, a setup for them to attend to their needs, attend to what they need, recognize that in order to level the playing field, it's not to say everyone's there and show your competency. You need to support and understand the different needs between different people, level the playing field so that it's an equal opportunity, and then evaluate on competencies. That's my perspective from what I've seen. I'd say that I do not think that women tend to avoid hard tasks. I think sometimes it's a systemic change. The environment is not set up for the success. So it's not that they are failing, it's that we are failing them as a society and as an organization by not setting up an inclusive climate for them to succeed.
Mohamed, I really want to thank you. I think that is a fantastic way to wrap it up. Really love your insights and the work that you are doing at APEGA. There isn't another regulator who's taken on this level of research to provide data for your registrants. So greatly appreciated. And while so many women know firsthand these experiences, I'm sure lots of people on the call are nodding their head, understanding the womanhood penalty, understanding the pay gap is something that they live every day. Having these statistics reaffirms this knowledge and validates them, and allows for EDI champions like yourself and others to have data as a tool in their pocket to say, engineering is no different than what we're seeing across the country in other fields. So thank you so much. We'll now take a short break. Just before our next panel, please feel free to do what you need, take a break, rest your eyes from the screen, stretch your legs. We just ask that you stay logged in throughout the break. Simply turn off your camera and your mic, as most of you have already done, and we will reconvene in 5 minutes sharp for the next panel discussion on workplace gender equity. So we'll see you soon.
Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining the next segment of today's program. Our next panel will be a look at workplace gender equity. Please welcome our panelists, Camille Hernandez Ramdoir, Sandeep Nair, and Hilary Bergseeker. Camille is the co-director and co-founder of the Equity Lime Collective, an anti-racism and EDI consulting firm. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Ryerson University and the academic coordinator for Caribbean Studies. She has over 20 years experience in teaching, research, and activism regarding anti-racism in Canada. Sandeep is the manager of business operations of Pride at Work Canada, with over a decade of experience in the EDI space. He has played a key role in developing 3 pioneering and impactful research publications on 2 SL LGBTQIA+ inclusion to achieve success in creating a safe and inclusive society. Hilary is an associate professor of social psychology at the University of Waterloo, where she reads the diversity and inclusion work and intergroup relations lab and serves on the Equity Data Advisory Committee. She also co-directs Project RISE within the Engendering Success in STEM Research Consortium. She has expertise in trust formation, bias reduction, diversity climate assessment, and network science. This panel will be moderated by Cassandra Polyzoo, Manager of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Engineers Canada. Over to you, Cassandra.
Thanks so much, Jeanette, and it is with great pleasure and I'm so super thrilled for this conversation on workplace equity. I'm excited to hear your insights and expertise from each of our panelists. You're bringing such diverse views from the work that you're doing. So maybe I'll first ask you each to introduce yourselves and how you found yourself in the work that you're doing today. And let's start with Sandeep. Do you mind going ahead first?
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Sandeep Nair. I use the pronouns he and they. I want to also gratefully acknowledge that I'm in the unceded territories of the Sunemu and Coast Salish people, which is known as Nanaimo in BC. That's where I work, reside, and learn. So how I got into this work is mainly because being a temporarily abled gay person of color, coming from a vibrant, cultural and ethnic background, I do understand the roles that organizations can play in harnessing the power of business for creating a positive social change. And with over 13 years of work experience and having worked as an EDI, that is Equity, Diversity, Inclusion consultant for over a decade, my work usually focuses largely on creating a safe and inclusive workplace environment for, say, in a workplace environment for all employees, job seekers, and professionals, but especially the towards LGBTQI+ community and people with disabilities. I have led many programs, campaigns, and provided training and consulting services to drive organizations' EDI strategy across different sectors and industries globally, where I share my personal lived experience to drive the importance of allyship, which is very important for the community, no matter what diversity you come from. But for today's conversation specifically, because my talk or my conversation is going to be mainly about the community, I also want to be talking about how to break away from the binary of, say, man and woman that we usually speak about in conversations, and cover the topic of the towards LGBTQI+ community, where I want to also bring in the aspect of the different concepts which come within the these conversations, like, for example, the concepts of sex, gender expression, and sexual orientation. To give you a simple, I would say, definition of each of these concepts, sex is merely just a label attached to human beings when we are born based on our genitalia or other physical characteristics. Whereas when we talk about gender or gender identity, it's a person's internal and individual experience of being a man, woman, both, or not even subscribing to the idea that gender is limited to these terms. So an individual's gender identity and sex can either be same or different. But also when we talk about gender expression, is the way we engage with conventions and stereotypes associated with a specific gender to present ourselves probably on a daily basis, through clothing, name, etc. For example, if I was wearing a frock and a gown, longer earrings, makeup today, then my gender expression would be feminine. But if I was wearing a cowboy hat and a shirt and a trouser, then it's again stereotypically my gender expression is masculine. But today I'm wearing a shawl and sitting in front of you. So my gender expression could be both masculine or, masculine and feminine, or neither masculine or feminine. So it's just merely stereotypes that's associated with how we present ourselves. And finally, definitely talking about sexual orientation, it's a person's personal characteristic that encompasses emotional, romantic, or sexual feelings that we have towards other people. So I think it's important to understand these concepts before I get into further conversations on what I'm going to be sharing today. Thank you.
So eloquently put. So thank you, Sandeep. Thank you so much. Next, I'll hand it over to Hilary. Do you mind introducing yourself and how you came to be in this space?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation to join you here today. I'll keep these remarks brief because I have so many thoughts I'd love to share on the questions you're going to ask us in a few moments. But I'll say, as a white woman and an immigrant to Canada, my journey to this area of work started with a longstanding concern about injustice, paired with a passion for bringing the scientific method to try to solve these kinds of problems. So as a diversity scientist and a social psychologist by training, my research focuses on bias reduction, so ways to combat racism, sexism, and so forth, and bridging divides between people from different backgrounds. And so within the Engendering Success in STEM Consortium, which again gets terrific support from Engineers Canada, I co-direct several research projects that specifically focus on increasing gender inclusion, as well as other forms of inclusion and allyship among STEM professionals in industry, government, and academia. So I'd love to share some insights from that work today.
And can't wait to hear about them, Hillary. Thank you so much. Camille, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Camille Hernandez Ramdoir, and I guess I came to this work, which for me is really about anti-racism, just being born in Canada as a racialized girl and living as a racialized woman. And the amount of racism that I experienced really pushed me to want to do something about that. And I've done that in a number of different levels. I do creative work. I write poetry, short stories, novels, so on. I went into academia. I became a professor. So through teaching, researching, writing, publishing, all those kinds of things was another avenue. And more recently, from 2020, I opened a consultancy, an anti-racist consultancy, an EDI consultancy, with a colleague of mine from Ryerson University, where we both teach, because I felt that I wanted to do something more practical with this knowledge, both experience, my lived experience as a racialized woman in this country, and my academic knowledge, and all these other years and years that I spent thinking, writing, speaking about what it means to be a racialized person in this part of the world. And by extension, the whole post-colonial project, because that is a big part of it. So that's how I'm sort of here today, and I'm sort of straddling all these different worlds, but at the end of the day, it's all about fighting for social justice and bringing attention to things that, for me, I question so often. Why are we still here, right? Why are we still in this position of so much inequity? I mean, I was listening to that statistic of 89% for women in terms of pay. And I thought, okay, well, that's better than 72% when I started teaching, right? But it's still 89%, and let's not even get into race, right? So we still have work to do, and I'm doing it, right? Among my colleagues here and so many other people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a great kind of jumping point of like, our first question for everyone was going to be about what's not working. And, it kind of like, why are we still here? After like decades and decades of knowing about gender gap, knowing about transphobia, knowing about racism in the workplace, why are we still here? What is not working? And, the 30 by 30 goal is about women in engineering, and it is about gender equity in the workplace. But from where you're coming from your perspective, what is not working for us to be getting to that gender parity aspect in the workplace? Maybe I'll throw that first question over to Hillary.
Well, thank you. I think it's a really important question, and that's part of the reason that I also got into this space, was this sort of frustration that there's lots of great intentions out there, but it seems like a lot of AEDI work has been founded on sort of best guesses rather than really sort of evidence-based best practices. And I think psychology has some real insights about what may be going wrong in some of these settings. And so we know from work in psychology and other, social sciences, that when diversity programs are implemented poorly, for example, when they're framed as a legal obligation, like a liability issue, or interpreted as leading to a sort of zero-sum situation where one group's gain has to translate into another group's loss, that actually can be very counterproductive. So that can make everybody's identities more salient in a way that builds defensiveness and kind of division or conflict between groups. Some of the concerning or factors that can worsen these kinds of situations are if members of advantaged groups, or whatever groups are sort of numerically particularly dominant in settings, I strongly believe that everything is already fair and equitable. So if they perceive that it's already a meritocracy and that everything is essentially working just fine, if they think that all the intergroup relationships in this setting are already positive. So if there's sort of a lack of awareness of some of the negative impacts or sort of other perspectives on how some of those day-to-day issues may be unfolding. And as well, if they feel like their own status and standing is being threatened, if a certain group, maybe men in engineering are used to being seen as sort of the prototype and having their ways of being, doing, expressing themselves seen as sort of the defaults, it can be disorienting and even threatening to have those sorts of defaults challenged. And there is some research suggesting that for men who feel that sense of threat, for example, then they're less supportive of efforts to expand opportunity and increase inclusion. So to be concrete about it, I would say the framing and the structure of initiatives matter. For example, mandatory trainings are ones that treat people as potential perpetrators, as well as even just adding a grievance system, for example. These are actually associated with negative outcomes, essentially decreases in the representation of people of color and women in management, looked at across a variety of organizations 5 years later. So those are the kinds of things I think we want to be really aware of, that it's not enough just to have good intentions. We really need to pay attention to what the research is telling us, and also think about the psychology of how to get people on board. So I can't wait to talk about what I think we can do right to actually make positive change later in this panel.
Amazing, thanks for that. Great starting point. Sandeep, would you mind taking that question next? So I'll just reiterate, looking at the gaps, like what's not working for gender equity in the workplace, and from your perspective of Pride at Work and the great work that you're doing there. So yeah, take it away.
So I think I will be probably taking it a step ahead, because currently, if you even look at the Federal Employment Equity Act, it says federally regulated industries have to take specific measures to accommodate, say, designated groups in the workplace. And they just list, say, women, visible minorities, indigenous, and people with disabilities. Unfortunately, they have not listed the 2S LGBTQI+ community in that. And that's very important to address, because, for example, when we look at gender, it is still within the binary of, say, man and woman. And but whereas gender is a spectrum, it is not just two aspects to gender. And even the usage of gender, we need to be mindful when we say the terms man and woman and not interchange that with male and female, because male and female is sex assigned, whereas man and woman is gender. So those are understandings that we need to first of all have. And it's also important for us to know that, when we specifically talk about the community, the 2S LGBTQI+ youth find it very difficult to find their first job itself into the workplace, mainly because they wouldn't have a supportive network of family and friends. And they usually graduate, with a significantly higher student debt compared to their cisgender, straight peers. And even, say, using 14 years of, say, research in terms of the, say, national population-based surveys, researchers from the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation, a not-for-profit research group, they have found that there are substantial income disparities among lesbian, gay, and bisexual Canadians compared to a heterosexual population. So according to the report, people who self-identify as a sexual minority had significantly lower median annual earnings compared to their heterosexual, specifically heterosexual men. So researchers say that the gaps were persistent even when they considered factors like differences in education level, etc. And that is a completely different topic when we talk about the access to education that the community has. But still, researchers, they also sought to describe why the LGBTQ+ people make so much more less than their straight counterparts, because they found that a complex intersection of industries, demographics, mental health, and even labor supply seems to also play a role in all of this. While the LGBTQ+ people on the whole face greater economic instability and make lesser money than their, say, comparatively straight men, the contrast is still starkest when we look at bisexual men and women who experience poorest outcomes when it comes to income, food security, mental health, and other factors. And while bisexual men and women, as well as gay men, all make less than their straight counterparts, you'll be surprised that lesbians actually make more money on an average than straight women. because for a lesbian woman's earnings, advantage in comparison to a heterosexual woman have been driven by differences in terms of demographics, their parental status, the hours that they work, the occupation that they have, mental health. Even the report reads that, to a larger extent, lesbians have actually shown a better tendency to share domestic duties, which is probably different when we talk about, heterosexual couple, when we talk about straight man and woman and how their domestic duties play into role. And researchers also argue that this is all further proof that we can't treat the LGBTQ plus community as a single entity, because this is not one entity, the group with a lot of things, because it has its own different identities within the spectrum, and each identity have their own challenges. And I know you must be wondering why I've been talking only about lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. That's mainly because the trans and gender diverse people are highly underrepresented in the Canadian workforce. And if you must know, in terms of statistics, they say though 89% of trans and gender diverse people have some college or university education, about 50% of them still fall under Canada's low-income households. The annual income is less than probably 15,000. And even despite the recent efforts by Statistics Canada to collect information on trans, two-spirit, and non-binary individuals in the 2021 census, its authors still acknowledge that there is simply not enough data to look into how these identities or these individuals with gender diverse folks are affected. But that research is still vital if you want to actually address some of these problems and challenges that they face. But there are still many biases, both conscious and unconscious, about the kind of person an employer still wants to employ or work with. And that's usually rooted in a cultural stereotype of the ideal worker that we have a picture in mind. So it's not easy challenging those cultural stereotypes, but we have to start somewhere, and we still have a very long way to go.
Thank you for that, and all that, the demographic data and the pay data is super interesting. And if there's any links that you have, we'd be happy to share them in the chat as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sandeep. Camille, a question for you around what is not working from your perspective when it comes to gender equity in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, again, as my colleagues have just pointed out, it's bigger than just gender. There's a number of things that are going on here, and part of it is just, let's just say, the dominant culture in Canada, which again comes out of this colonial background, has been reluctant to want to share the power. And we see this every day. We see this in so many, particularly when we look at the status of Indigenous people in Canada. So there's steps forward in terms of whether it's gender parity or more racialized people in the workforce, particularly in particular professions, because I do want to make one point, which is that women have always been in the workforce, right? In fact, women are overrepresented in some professions. And which professions are those? Those tend to be the service professions, the helping professions, the nurturing professions, and usually the underpaid professions. So if we're really talking about, where are women missing, it tends to be in maybe the more plum jobs, the white collar professional, the real status. So the status position. So what's going on there? What I've seen and what seems to be the issue is that you make inroads and you see things happen, and then there's the backlash. And the backlash always happens because people who have had power and privilege for generations aren't just going to give that up easily. So it takes, different tactics. And Hillary made a good point there, which is that, it's one thing, you can try all these different tactics. Okay. So whether you legislate it or you train people or you do any number of things. And this is certainly what we found with Equity Lime Collective is we don't do training. We're really upfront about, we don't train people to be anti-racist because we don't believe that that's possible. There has to be a will. The only way any of this is going to change is that people have to have the will behind it, that this has to happen. And once you get a concerted number of people who understand and are committed to that and are saying this is important and it's going to happen and we're not going to take no for an answer and we're not just going to roll over and, that's when you're going to see the real change happen. And thankfully, I think that is happening, but you have to be prepared for the backlash. You cannot go out there and say, we're going to just legislate, we're going to just do training, we're going to just have quotas, we're going to just, do all these sorts of quantifiable changes, because there's something else going on with people, with ideas about power, ideas about privilege, and people being scared, right? People who then are going to have to give up privilege, being scared. And sometimes the tactic is dealing with that fear, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's dealing with that fear. It's also, look at the writing on the wall. The writing's on the wall. We're not going back in the magic box, right? We're out. Whoever we are, we're out here now. Whether we're racialized people, whether we're women, racialized women, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ+, we're not going back to business as usual. We're not going back 500 years to the way things were. There's been a total and absolute and definite shift globally. So it's basically, we're at a point now where it's like, so how are you going to make this happen as painlessly as possible? Those of you that are resistant to it, understand that you're going to be swept away in the force that's happening, right? Because there's a younger generation coming up, and it is quite astounding, to be honest, especially 2 years ago when we saw globally what was happening after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and so on. Young people just taking the helm, just taking the torch and going out there and tearing down statues and just, it's over. And part of that is saying, wherever there have been these bastions of privilege, whether it's white privilege, male privilege, heteronormative privilege, able-bodied privilege, it's not business as usual. So how are we going to make this transition in a way that hopefully everybody will feel that they are winning in this?
And you hear that a lot with lots of folks in whether it's employers or whether it's folks in leadership positions, sort of wondering, how do I do this? What am I supposed to do? And they do turn to EDI providers, they turn to certification programs like Credit Work, they turn to research. And so how do we then, what is working, and how do we try to translate these things that you're all talking about to practices in the workplace? And so that's kind of our next question, and I'll hand it over to Hillary.
Thank you again for the opportunity to talk about sort of what do we do. And I think that's a really important and sometimes missing part of the conversation. With all the sort of discouraging information I just shared earlier about what doesn't work, part of that is if we have this orientation on sort of don't do this, don't do that, and we don't lay out for people what a positive culture actually looks like and what it means, what each of us can bring to the table to be part of creating an inclusive, thriving environment. And I think even within the context of how Engineers Canada talks about these things, I think that there's sort of some room for growth, I would say, in the sense of I love the vision behind the idea of the 30 by 30 goal, but even there, the idea is if you want 30% women, people can see that as very zero sum. I wouldn't want young male engineers to think that they could only be part of the problem by, getting their PN certification, because then they're adding to the wrong side of the equation. We don't want a mentality where everybody's either, a member of an underrepresented group or they're in the way. There are ways for all of us to work together again. And I think that, I agree with a lot of what Camille shared, but I think when I'm working with people and actually trying to change hearts and minds, we often try to we do a lot of work up front to try to build common values, to really get people into a place where they're open to new information, to new ideas, to things that may threaten their long-held assumptions. It's uncomfortable to recognize that the positions you hold, the privileges you enjoy, might not be solely based on your hard work and your deservingness, but that they might have other factors contributing to them, sort of unseen advantages. And I think to help people recognize that and be willing to combat that, that's really quite a psychological process. So some of the tips that we work on in psychology partly is about building a coalition, getting people who are similar to the folks who need persuading, sometimes to be really vocal proponents. So I'm not saying that we just need a bunch of white male able-bodied cisgendered advocates, but it's actually really important to have people on board who are from, from all backgrounds, including the advantaged backgrounds, saying that things need to change. This change is important. This change aligns with all of our values. This will be best for everyone in the end. Having a positive vision that we can work toward, focus on what we want to do. I think so oftentimes being more focused on sorry, just looking at my notes here, being pro-inclusion, even more so than necessarily being anti-bias. And the research studies, when you experiment with mindsets that put people in an orientation of learning and growth versus tell them don't be racist, you actually see much better results from that sort of learning and growth orientation. So I think the more that we can put people in a mindset of we all have positive things to contribute, that we can each play a positive role regardless of our background or identity or which lived experiences we bring to the table. Obviously, it's really important to center the experiences of people who haven't had a place at that table for a long, long time. That's critical. But I think that this isn't about just turning the tables and having women, be in charge and men be marginalized, for example, right? We're not talking inversion here. We're talking true inclusion, which just means everyone gets to contribute. That gives us the best possible engineering outputs, the best possible community, the best possible promotion and retention. And to make this, again, more concrete, what our team does is voluntary training. So there's excellent research that voluntary training, like outreach and other strategies like having task forces responsible for diversity, those are actually empirically linked to big increases in representation. So when you can, yes, you may be recruiting the choir, but teaching that choir when to sing and how to sing is really important. And also motivating that choir to expand, getting some people who are fence straddlers to think maybe I really can be an ally, maybe inclusion is something I care about. I think that's very important. And encouraging, exciting results from this work that Engineers Canada has helped fund. We're seeing that even that when people participate in our sort of randomized control trial inclusion training that's very evidence-based, that includes all these pragmatic principles I've described about how to really get people psychologically on board with inclusion, 18 months later, we're seeing that they're more engaged with their organization. So that means less burnout, more likely to stay with their work, finding their work more meaningful, that they feel more like they fit in their workplaces if they've done inclusion training compared with a matched control. And so we're really excited about that. We're happy to welcome more organizations in. It's free of cost. And again, huge thanks to Engineers Canada for making this empirical work on best practices possible to really highlight what can we do, how can we get everyone on board and moving in the right direction and creating real change here.
For sure. Thanks so much, Hillary. And sorry to cut you off. I know we've kind of met our time, but we still have to hear from Camille and Sandeep, and we'll put some links in the for Engineering Success in STEM in the chat. But hopefully, folks can stay on for a little bit longer. Would love to hear from Camille, maybe first on what is working, on this change project, and how do you disrupt what exists to create something new?
Yeah. And again, I'll try to be brief, but I think we have to meet people where they are. And this is on a number of different fronts. So that means people who are resistant, we try to have these kinds of conversations with them to find out, where is your resistance coming from? What is it really about? And like I said, very often it's just fear. It's fear of change. It's fear of loss. It's fear of, I'm a bad person. Sometimes if we're talking to them about racism, they're not even really sure what racism is, right? Like, am I being racist right now? I don't know, so we have to have those kinds of conversations. But I think at the same time, we have to be very careful to protect the people who are the marginalized group in this setting. So for example, one of the things that we've done is we at a certain point in the work that we do, we have groups that are just for white employees only, and groups that are for racialized employees only. And we explain why we do that. And it's interesting to see how resistant people are to that, like, particularly the privileged group, not understanding that. Isn't that racist that you're doing that? And no, it's not. You have to understand that we need to have separate spaces sometimes to work through, as everyone's been saying, these very difficult conversations, and to get, to find a way so then we can then come back together and work together. And we've had a better conversation that way. So I think that's something else I wanted to say.
Love that, and look forward to hearing more from you, Camille, maybe at another time. Sandeep, I'll pass the last, so you'll have the last word on this question. And again, my apologies that this has been so short. We know that we could hear a lot more from all of you, so please go ahead.
I'll be very brief again in terms of, I would say, how to ensure that we create a safe, I would say, gender equity safe space would be in terms of ensuring that starting from hiring and retention of your, I would say, employees, and ensuring that they feel included, even in terms of hiring and talent acquisition, ensure that from your job description to your application forms to your interviewing process, everything is inclusive. It would also be a great bigger deal even if you say, okay, start with pronouns. Hi, I'm so-and-so, these are my pronouns. Are we comfortable sharing yours? That would go a long way. Even ensuring that you have the policies and benefits within the workplace that is inclusive, addressing the needs and requirements of all the different identities within the spectrum. So just because you're addressing, say, needs of same-sex couples does not mean you're also addressing the needs of, say, a woman who is a person of color, who's from the LGBTQ plus community, and someone who's using a wheelchair. You need to then look at what are their needs. I mean, because they are from an aspect of different intersectionality of identities. So addressing those needs are very important. And also, I would say occasionally conducting an employee demographic survey to understand what is the employee diversity you have within the workforce and what are some of the needs that you need to put into place so that they feel respected, valued, and also seen within the workplace. Finally, as leaders, ensuring that you constantly have, I would say, programs where you're mentoring and nurturing a senior LGBTQ plus talent, if possible, and also programs and trainings where you're educating your employees to become positive agents of change to promote allyship for all the different employees within the workplace. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. We've posted some of the links to your organizations. If folks want to hear more about the great work that you're doing, get in touch with you as individuals. Maybe if you're available, you're super busy people. You provide tons of insights into how to improve and how to disrupt and how to create change. I really, really do appreciate you sharing with us today. We hope to stay in touch. I'm going to pass the mic over to Gerard, our CEO, to wrap us up for today. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks very much, Cassandra. And thank you so much, Camille, Sandeep, and Hillary, for joining us. We have so much gratitude that you shared your thoughts and expertise with us. It's unfortunate we didn't have more time. Obviously, you're very committed and knowledgeable in your areas of expertise, and hopefully we can continue this discussion further at some point in time. That brings the end to today's session, and I just point out that we still have 2 more sessions left in the 30 by 30 series. So everyone, please join us next week on April 20th for the second session of our 2022 conference. We put a registration link in the chat if you haven't already had a chance to register, and we will be taking part in an interactive workshop on intersectionality, and we hope to see you there. So have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week and the week after. Goodbye now.